Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our Enterprise Multi-Cloud Management Best Practices Summit, brought to you by Nutanix. Our editorial staffs have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a Surface Pro 8, but you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from Nutanix available on the console right now, so please download and check those out, and we thank them again for supporting the community. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Expert Best Practices for Multi-Cloud Environments. This session features Elias Knazer, Chief of Research at EK Media Group. He's a thought leader in the areas of cloud computing and digital disruption. Until recently, Elias was a research vice president at Gartner, where he spent 7 years focusing on private, hybrid, and public cloud computing. Today, he continues to conduct research and advise and engage customers and vendors on all aspects of cloud, edge, and data center transformation strategies. He's well known for his ability to simplify complex technical concepts and explain how IT aligns with and forwards business goals. Elias, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the opportunity, and welcome everyone to this session. Like David said, my name is Elias Knazer. I'm Chief of Research for EK Media Group. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on Twitter, and also on YouTube. If you like this type of content, I typically publish on YouTube about once a week, one question, one answer type of videos, all related to cloud and edge and the data center. Today, we're going to focus on some best practices that I've collected over my years of talking and advising customers on this particular topic. Now, the number one thing that I would say is important to start with is decide on how you're going to use multi-cloud. Now, note, I use the term decide here. I use the verb decide here because I'm a firm believer that multi-cloud is no longer a matter of if. Multi-cloud is a matter of when and how, and we're going to talk about that at length a little bit here. But decide on how you're going to use multi-cloud. And by that, I mean, are you going to use a replicated multi-cloud model, or are you going to use a distributed multi-cloud model? Let's start with replicated for a second. A replicated multi-cloud model means that you're going to deploy essentially the same workloads on multiple cloud providers. So if you've got apps and databases on cloud provider A, you're going to deploy the same apps and databases on cloud provider B. This reduces your lock-in significantly. It allows you to have high degrees of portability, but it also reduces your leveraging of cloud to essentially IaaS, or infrastructure as a service. Here, you're using virtual machines, you're using containers, and you're using, obviously, data, but you're able to replicate it, you're able to synchronize it, and you're able to move between cloud providers with relative ease. I won't say that it's easy, or I wouldn't also recommend that you do this, for example, several times a day, but you have high degrees of portability here, and you're reducing your lock-in to a large degree. So some of the benefits of this type of an approach is you have a lot of customers that want to take a primary, secondary approach. And this is for a variety of reasons. Sometimes customers are really happy with a single cloud provider. That one cloud provider is meeting all of their needs, all of their demands. But then work happens, life happens, right? Either the risk department is going to step in and say, diversify, and they will force you to diversify. Regulators might step in and force you to diversify. And sometimes there are things that are out of your control that will force you to diversify, like a merger and acquisition that will come into play. At that point, you will have a decision to make. Are you going to migrate everything to the single cloud provider that you're consolidating on, or are you going to have some kind of a primary-secondary approach? By primary and secondary, what I mean is oftentimes customers will basically say, we're going to put 60, 70, 80% of our workloads on cloud provider A, and then we're going to put 20 or 30% of our workloads on cloud provider B. So that gives you the ability to, again, diversify to a large degree between providers while maintaining most of the workloads on a single provider. Another approach that works really well for replicated multi-cloud, again, here, it forces you into an IaaS environment, virtual machines, containers, and data. But for BCDR, that could also work very well because, again, here you're focusing on replicating those assets from cloud provider A to cloud provider B. And then you also have the ability to do forms of active-active. Now, active-active is not cheap, especially if you're going to do it across multi-cloud. I haven't seen a lot of customers try to take this approach because it's also costly, it's operationally challenging. If you're doing it at an IaaS level, it's easier, but it's not easy. But as you start to go up a little bit into the PaaS layer, it becomes a little more complex with all the different APIs and the integrations and the services that are one-to-one. So there are some customers where I've seen this type of an approach, again, to try to mitigate against an entire regional failure from a cloud provider. But to a large degree, this is usually not the driver, but it's a technical option, so I wanted to make sure that I list it. If you're interested, we can talk more in depth on this in the Q&A section. Now, the other approach is a distributed multi-cloud model. And a distributed multi-cloud model, what you're doing is you're taking components of the same application and you're distributing them across different cloud providers. So you can have your app servers and your database servers on cloud provider A, and you can have your web servers on cloud provider B. Now, for example, to bring this to light, Microsoft and Oracle have a strategic partnership where they've interconnected their regions so that you're able to get access to high bandwidth, low latency between Oracle Cloud and Microsoft Azure. So the idea here is that you're using best of breed, essentially. You're able to use everything on Azure, but you're able to use the Oracle workloads on Oracle, which includes Exadata and a lot of the other things that Oracle will offer, but you're able to use best of breed. Customers will also take this approach. For example, I've seen a lot of customers that will use Amazon Redshift because they like Amazon Redshift maybe for its data warehousing capabilities, but then they want to use Microsoft Azure Power BI because they prefer Power BI's visualization capabilities. So again, here you're able to leverage best of breed. Customers will also take this form of an approach when they're trying to have access to, they want to make sure they have innovation insurance. So just in case one of the providers tomorrow morning has a new product or offering that is significantly more advantageous or gives them a competitive edge, that they've already operationalized the second cloud and they're able to use it with relative ease. Now, I will say the distributed multi-cloud approach is an innovative approach. I don't see it as often as I see, for example, the primary, secondary. I would say with the replicated approach, that's probably the most of the focus of how multi-cloud is being used. But this is definitely something that is up and coming, and I think we'll see more and more of it in the years to come. Now, the takeaway here, the advice that I would give you, and notice this first best practice is more geared towards IaaS and PaaS environments. It doesn't really apply to SaaS environments because, again, if you have multiple SaaS environments, you're already in a multi-cloud environment and you kind of don't need this approach. So this is primarily for IaaS and PaaS. But the takeaway here, the advice that I would give you is plan for multi-cloud, even if you don't intend on using multi-cloud today. And the reason for that is, again, there are things that are outside of your control that might force themselves on you. Again, something like a merger and acquisition where maybe you hadn't considered it, but bada boom, here comes another organization that you've acquired that has a cloud provider that you're not using. So what do you do in that case? And the reason that plans for multi-cloud, even if you don't intend on using it, is important is because you want to make all of the decisions, all of your purchasing decisions, all of your training decisions, everything that you make these decisions as if you were in a multi-cloud environment. So that if you're buying a tool, you know that this tool is going to work for AWS and potentially Azure, or for Azure and Google, or IBM and Oracle. So you want to make sure you're ahead of these purchases so that you don't end up with having tool sprawl, where you have all of these tools and they're only focused on one cloud provider, or they can manage one cloud provider to a large degree, but the secondary cloud provider not so much. So you want to make sure that you're trying as much as possible to stay ahead of the game. So plan for multi-cloud as if you were using it today. The number two thing that I would recommend is optimize your workloads to each provider's strength. So like we talked about in the first best practice, which is primary, secondary, one of the other approach that you can use is an opportunistic cloud approach, which means you're going to assess and evaluate each workload independently, and then you're going to decide that based on this particular workload, I'm going to put it on AWS or on Azure or Google or whichever cloud provider that you're using. There are some criteria that will differentiate these cloud providers. I'm not going to get into all of them here. It's a little too much. It'll require its own session. But for example, if you were to ask me and you have a workload that requires high degrees of availability, where you want to make sure that this workload is spread across multiple availability zones and multiple regions, yada, 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 I would say you probably want to go with AWS for this particular workload. If you have a workload that's maybe more hybrid in nature, that you know is going to be, that's going to require different components on different clouds, maybe that wants a cloud provider that's more hybrid friendly, I would say go with Azure for a variety of reasons that we can get into. If you're looking for if you have a workload that, for example, requires high performance compute and requires a lot of GPU power or CPU power, all three cloud providers have these options. But again, I would say AWS with spot instances and the length of time that they've been doing Hadoop clusters and some of these other things, I would say maybe lean a little more towards AWS. So there are some of these requirements that can come into play as you're assessing these workloads that will direct the workload towards one cloud provider versus the other. So here the idea is make sure that you're playing to that cloud provider's strength that can support the workload that you're migrating to. When it comes to management, this is something that comes up often from customers. We're always asked, should we go with the native tools? Should we go with third-party tools? There isn't a clear answer that I would say. I'm going to start with say it depends, probably my favorite answer, but I won't leave it there. I would say start with the native tools. And let me tell you why I say start with the native tools. When you're starting with the native tools, you're going to be able to get a sense for the features, the capabilities that you're going to use with these native tools. These native tools are going to have a ton of capabilities. It's not likely that you're going to use all of these capabilities. You're going to use a subset of these capabilities. By starting with the native tools, you're able to know what features, services, and capabilities you need to manage this environment. So as you start with the native tools when you're on a single cloud provider, as you move to multi-cloud, now you know that when you want to assess a third-party tool, you know what you're assessing them for. Because here's the thing, you're not going to find a single tool that's going to rule them all. There is no unicorn tool that you can manage everything from a single pane of glass. That doesn't exist, and don't make the mistake of assuming that you're going to find a tool that will do that. You want to be careful from tools that will do one cloud provider very well, but not the other cloud provider. So again, you're going into a multi-cloud environment. You want feature parity between what this tool can do on AWS and on Azure, or on Azure and Google, depending on the clouds that you're selecting or that you're choosing to use. You also want to understand that these third-party tools don't necessarily have feature parity with the native tools. So most customers, all customers that I've talked to at least, you'll find yourself, although the third-party tool is helpful and you're using it, you're always going back to these native tools. But for the moment, I haven't seen an environment where you're able to remove yourself from using these native tools. But there are benefits and advantages to using third-party tools, and we'll talk about those in a second, and I'll give you some of my opinions there. But just understand, as you're trying to leverage these tools, that you're not going to find one that's going to be the solution for all of them. So understanding also the pros and cons of abstraction layers. So there's a lot of these tools that you can deploy on cloud providers, on premises, that you can abstract everything and essentially manage from this tool, right? So you're looking at things like Red Hat's OpenShift or Pivotal or other tools where you can essentially abstract the cloud providers, deploy it on premises, and again, bada bing, bada boom, here you're managing from the same console. These approaches are valid. Technically, they work as advertised, right? But some of the things that you want to ask yourself is, well, if you take this approach, you're back in infrastructure mode, right? So now you are responsible for maintaining this new platform. You are responsible for monitoring it, for scaling it. You are also now responsible with this type of an approach for any of the issues that might arise. You're also abstracting yourself from all of the native capabilities that these cloud providers will offer. So let's say, AWS releases new features or capabilities, or Azure, it's likely that the platform will support them immediately, but there could also be a lag. So if you're looking to access these features immediately, they may or may not be available there, which will again force you to fall back on those native capabilities. So you just want to make sure when you're using these abstraction layers in understanding why you're using them, right? So again, if you're using them because you're trying to avoid lock-in, well, you just locked yourself in with the abstraction layer, right? So if you're on OpenShift or on Pivotal, now you're locked in with this particular provider. So again, understanding these pros and cons will go a long way. The abstraction layers have been around. They work really well. But it depends on your circumstances and what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes they are the right choice, sometimes they are not. From my perspective, you're going to the cloud for all of the richness and the features that you have. By abstracting them, it kind of defeats the purpose. And one of the arguments that I typically use is, if you're going to use this type of an approach, then why even go to the cloud, right? You can use a co-location provider, you can use any hosting provider for that matter, and then just deploy your platform on top of it, and you're off to the races, and you can always integrate different clouds. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use this. Just be careful as you're selecting these types of approaches as far as why you're selecting them. Where third-party management tools really work well is anytime you're dealing with cost optimization. So I definitely recommend third-party tools for cost optimization. I think that that's one of the areas where you can potentially consolidate and have a single tool that you can connect with multiple cloud providers that will give you good recommendations, that will audit and track your usage of your assets on these multiple cloud providers, and as a result, be able to make recommendations on how you can lower these costs. So from a cost optimization perspective, from a governance perspective to a large degree, I would say the third-party tools, this is an area where it really shines. So here, I would highly recommend it. When it comes to provisioning and managing and that type of an approach, you want to be careful. When it comes to monitoring and backing up, again, these third-party tools tend to work really well. And one of the reasons why third-party tools will work well across multiple clouds is they're able to optimize management, right? So take something like a load balancer. Instead of using the native load balancing tools on AWS, Azure, and Google, if you've got a third-party load balancer that you're able to leverage, well, now your configuration, your management approach is standardized to a large degree. You might have to make some tweaks here and there, even within the tool, but to a large degree, you've standardized how you're managing. And that will apply to security assets as well. If you're deploying firewalls or other, it'll have the same type of an approach there as well. Define programmatic policies. This one is important because here what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're able to, when you're in the cloud, especially because so far we've been talking primarily about IaaS and PaaS. But as you start to get into the governance aspects, now you're going to extend a lot of what we're talking about today also to your SaaS application. So you want to make sure that you're able to at a basic level, understand who has access to what cloud services, right? You want to be able to know what those individuals can do and under what conditions. So maybe you have an administrator that can access Azure virtual machines in a European region, and they've got maybe full access there. But then that same user might not have access to Salesforce except in a very basic manner. So ensuring that you're putting in the right policies, and ideally these policies would be programmatic or automated in nature so that you're able to scale a lot easier with them, will be crucial. And when you're applying these policies, you have to apply them to a lot more than just identity and security. It's obvious that in this area, that's the first thing that you're probably going to look at. But you also want to make sure that you're doing the same thing for provisioning, for example. You want to do the same thing for cost management. You want to do the same thing when you're doing any form of monitoring or analytics, for that matter, any form of inventory. Those policies have to be there to help you manage this environment a lot easier, especially as you scale, and especially if you add more than two cloud providers. Because we've seen customers that go, they start off with two cloud providers, but oftentimes I've seen three, sometimes four. So depends on the type of organization, depends on the culture, depends on what you're trying to accomplish. That will dictate how you're doing this. So the more programmatic and automated you can be, the easier that's going to be. Create an audit process. So as you start to get into cloud in general, your users are going to be more empowered. They are going to be able to do things from a self-service perspective a lot more than they were in the past. You're putting in place a lot of policies. You're putting in place a lot of policies, for that matter. So you need to create some kind of an audit process. Every time you make a change somewhere, that change might have an implication on other areas. So you want to make sure that there's an audit process that regularly is able to look at these policies, is able to look and adjust when and where some things are changing. So having a clean audit process becomes really important if you're going to continue to support multiple clouds. And this audit process, again, can be automated. There's a lot of tools that are out there that will tell you when certain users are getting access to what. It's just a matter of how you're going to analyze these logs and how you're going to be able to continuously try to adjust to them. But having an audit process in today's world is going to be crucial as you're managing this environment. Consistency is going to be your friend when you're using multi-cloud. Now, consistency is going to apply, and you're going to be able to use it in a couple of different formats. So the first thing that I would recommend is, if you don't have a self-service portal, self-service capabilities, I would highly recommend that you do that, because that's going to give your users a consistent user experience. So whether there's 2 or 3 or 4 cloud providers, as far as the user is concerned, you've kind of abstracted that completely from them. So they're going to the self-service page that you've created for them based on the policies, the rights, the security posture that you have. They're going to get access to certain services. Maybe they can request access to other services. Maybe you've got a catalog of services that is available that they can request. But the idea here is that you're doing things in a self-service manner, in a consistent manner, regardless of the cloud providers that you are supporting, and regardless of whether or not this is infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or software as a service. They're able to get access to the things that they need. So that consistency from a self-service becomes important. When you're onboarding cloud providers, it's important to also have consistency in how you're operationalizing these cloud providers. So, for example, if you've onboarded AWS and you've decided that we're going to create a strategy on how we're going to create VPCs and accounts. How many accounts are you going to create within AWS? How many VPCs are you going to create in AWS? Why did you arrive at this design? All of the things that you learn with your first cloud provider, make sure you apply those to any other cloud providers that you're going to onboard. So when you go to onboard Microsoft Azure, for example, you want to apply the same best practices that you've learned when you did AWS with accounts and subscriptions and VNets and resource groups and all of the things that Azure has, so that you are, again, trying to do this in a very consistent manner, because when you go to use third-party tools to manage these environments, it'll be a lot easier if things are as close to each other as possible. Now, these cloud providers are going to be pretty different to some degree, but to a large degree, they're very similar. AWS has VPCs, Azure has VNets, Google has a similar construct, and so on and so forth. So the consistency here is going to be the same. Another area of consistency when you're trying to onboard is a tagging strategy. So you want to make sure that the tagging strategy that you apply on AWS is very similar to the tagging strategy you apply on Azure and Google and Oracle and IBM and others. So if users can't create a virtual machine on AWS until they've tagged the department that is the owner of this asset, then the same thing should apply in Azure and in Google. So they can't proceed forward until they've selected a tag. That helps you as you go back to do any form of chargeback or showback or any kind of justification for why the cost or the spend is a certain amount every month. The tagging strategy is going to be that foundational asset that you have at your disposal that will be able to justify why certain things are costing and who's using them. So again, that gives you a way from an audit trail perspective to go to this department and say, hey, this month you guys spent $1,000 on these resources, all of these assets. Do you still need all of them? Is there a way to optimize them? It gives you a way to also look at how they're using them, and architecturally, is this the best approach to use something? And a quick example here is going to be if they've deployed 10 or 15 web servers that are serving the same function, there is a conversation to be had. Hey, do we need 10 web servers that are on all the time, or can we create an auto-scaling group, deploy maybe 2 or 3 servers, and then let's create some automation, some programmatic policies around it that say, when the auto-scaling group hits 80% CPU utilization, I want to deploy a new server. When it falls below 60% CPU utilization, I want to remove a server. And you could do that to memory and storage and a whole bunch of other resources. So it's crucial that you start with that consistency across these cloud providers. You also want consistency across how you manage both of these cloud providers. So if you're choosing third-party management tools, you want to be able to manage all of the cloud providers that you have with that third-party management tool. So you don't want to manage AWS with one tool and then select a different tool for Azure. You want to avoid the tool sprawl as much as possible, because I can't tell you how difficult it will be in the cloud, especially when you want to consider that you already have probably tool sprawl on premises, right? I've seen many organizations that have several monitoring tools on premises, sometimes several backup tools on premises, several automation and provisioning tools. So we want to avoid that, because we're already starting from a subset of tools on-prem. When we go to the cloud, we don't want to add to that. So make sure that you're assessing what you currently have, see if you can leverage what you currently have, or if you're trying to replace, make sure that what you're going to replace with can also manage on-premises. So we don't want to create a different set of tools for the cloud and a different set of tools for what you're managing on-premises. Train your engineers for multi-cloud. This one is interesting, because I've had several conversations with organizations that take the approach that they're going to have dedicated teams for dedicated clouds. My opinion, my approach, and my experience tells me that that depends also. It depends on the type of engineers that we're talking about. If we're talking about developers, then I would say yes, you want different teams that support different clouds. There are different languages, there are different APIs. Cross-training here is probably not very efficient. So when we're talking about developers, those should be dedicated teams for dedicated clouds, and you need to come up with the right justification for that at that time. That's going to cost a certain amount of money, yada, yada, yada. But those should be different teams for different clouds. But when we're talking about infrastructure and operations, when we're talking about security for that matter, I would say that you can cross-train infrastructure and operations engineers, security engineers, to manage multiple clouds. So again, when you think about the constructs of these cloud providers, if we're taking AWS, Azure, and Google here, just because they're the 3 big ones, their concepts are similar, right? So if AWS has auto-scaling, Azure has auto-scale, and Google has the same thing. If they have VPCs, there's VNet for Azure, and the same thing with Google. If we're talking about load balancers, they have similar features. Now, these features are managed differently. They have different capabilities, different things that you can configure, and you can configure it in a different way. But if you've got someone that's very seasoned engineer on AWS and you drop them on the Azure platform, it'll take them 2 or 3 hours, but they'll be able to find their way around with relative ease, which is why my advice to folks that are leveraging multi-cloud and folks that don't intend on using multi-cloud today, again, this goes back to plan for multi-cloud even if you don't intend on using it today. Train your users for multi-cloud even if you don't intend on using it today. So when someone starts and goes through AWS training, make sure when they're done, you also send them to Azure training. And that training could be online, could be books, whatever, but make sure that they're familiar with that secondary cloud provider that you've identified, which is another important aspect when you're deciding on multi-cloud. Identify that second cloud provider early. So again, even if you don't plan on using the second cloud provider, identifying that second provider is important because it helps you make that purchasing decision. It helps you make that training decision. And the same thing will apply for security professionals. Security professionals that are doing something on AWS will be able to apply the same thing on Azure and Google. So when it comes to training, you're able to take advantage of I&O professionals and security professionals across multiple clouds. Now, is the environment too big and the workload is too much and you've got large estates on multiple cloud providers that would justify that you silo them again? Sure. I mean, I guess that depends on the circumstance, but I would say for the majority of folks, you want to have cross-training, and it should be achievable that your engineers are able to manage multiple clouds with relative ease. Now, you'll notice here we've been focusing a lot on IaaS and PaaS, and there's a reason for that. Again, like I mentioned earlier, when you're talking about SaaS, you're probably already in a multi-cloud environment with SaaS. You probably have, Salesforce and, maybe Office 365 or Microsoft 365. I mean, there's just a lot of these SaaS providers. The SaaS multi-cloud best practices will hinge more on integration, more on some of the basic administrative functions. So, for example, a lot of customers will forget that it is their responsibility to back up their data, even when you're using SaaS. So even if you're using Salesforce or Microsoft 365, and even if they offer their own backup solution, the advice is it's your data. You are responsible for this data, and as a result, you should back up this data. You always want to look at not how, whether they do back up, but how quickly they can recover from an outage. You also want to consider how big that outage could be and, where are you going to be in the queue of recovery. So if it's an outage that only impacts you, that might be a little easier. If it's an outage that's impacting everyone, then, there's going to be a queue for when you get access back to your data. So ensuring that you are responsible for your data across your on-premises environment, across the cloud, and across the edge is going to be crucial for you. And the same thing will apply for monitoring, for integration, for identity specifically, so whether it's single sign-on and how you're going to take that approach. So when it comes to SaaS, it's more of an integration play and it's more of an administrative play. So those were the things that I've seen that customers, that I've advised customers on over the years. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to David for some Q&A.
Okay, great job. And we'll get to those questions in a second. First, I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's get to them. First question comes from Christian. This was early on, Elias, when you were talking about optimizing workloads for the different strengths of the cloud providers. And Christian asked, is there a resource that can be used to quickly highlight the strengths of each cloud provider?
That's a fantastic question. As far as resources, as in if you're looking for a tool that will say, AWS is strong here or Azure is strong there, There's a lot of research. I mean, Gartner will have research that will tell you the strength of each of the cloud providers in different areas, like how they're doing in terms of availability, in terms of network, in terms of security or storage. So they'll give you the highlights there, but as I'm sure you know, it will really depend on the workload. So for one workload, even though AWS might be the best in terms of security, you might still choose Azure for a variety of reasons. So it will depend, but there are a lot of tools out there that will highlight to you in general how they stack up against one another, Gartner being one of them, and I'm sure there are other research firms out there that will publish similar research and reports. I'm working on a course for Pluralsight that will talk about the differences between AWS, Azure, and Google as well. There's a ton of resources out there that you can look at that will also highlight them side by side. I will say here, be careful of the source of this material, right? So again, you want to make sure that's a trusted source. You want to make sure that you're getting information that is validated, information that is not presented to you for a hidden agenda. But there are some resources. I think there could be a better job being done out there for something a little more where there's a platform that constantly gives you, pros and cons and puts them together side by side, but there are some resources out there. I know it's a long-winded answer, but I just want to make sure that I'm clear on how you're going to use that, because it'll certainly make a difference. So the other thing I will add here, and that's something I meant to also mention during the presentation, when you're looking at these providers, and let's talk about the top three, or you can add Oracle and others into the mix. For the most part, I would say maybe 95% of the workloads will work on any of these cloud providers with no problems. It usually comes down to that 5%, these workloads that require something very specific. So, I'll give you examples from the past. These don't necessarily apply today. But in the past, AWS, for example, had the ability to do NFS. So you're able to mount NFS shares with relative ease, but you couldn't mount CIFS or SMB shares with relative ease. Now they have something that does support that, but it's still not as good as what Azure offers in terms of SMB or CIFS as a service. On the other hand, for a while there, Azure's NFS capabilities weren't as good as AWS's NFS capabilities. So depending on the application and whether or not it needed access to these types of protocols, you chose one provider versus the other. So these are the subtle differences that only you, as someone that's managing this environment, will know these applications have some of these specific needs, and then you go search specifically for those needs and be able to compare these providers side by side. So don't take them in lump sum. Azure is better than AWS or vice versa. Dig into some of the details. That's a fantastic question, brother.
Okay, fantastic answer also. And also, Christian had a follow-up question. He says, I am told one of the biggest considerations is data transfer costs. Should the strategy be to contain the workload data within the platform when possible? When is moving the data across platform or off the platform advantageous?
Great question. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So here you're talking about egress traffic costs. Now, egress traffic costs for a long time were a showstopper. So a lot of customers avoided or were hesitant to use multi-cloud in particular, or even to use cloud adjacency. Cloud adjacency happens to be one of my favorite architectures, which is really good for workloads that you can't move into the cloud. Think of an AS400, for example. So instead of moving it into a cloud, you bring it closer to a cloud. You bring it into like a co-location facility of some sort, where these cloud providers are in the same facility, and you've got a fiber cross-connect, so you're getting access to high bandwidth, low latency. And the concern there was always, well, there's egress traffic costs. There were customers that had large amounts of data. So I talked to a customer not too long ago that their job, and I won't mention who they are, they take high-quality satellite imagery. Each one of these images was like a terabyte in size. And what they were trying to avoid is moving it into a cloud provider, because by moving it, you're creating an immediate lock-in just by the sheer size of the data, and they wanted access from multiple clouds for a variety of reasons. So they ended up putting this in a colo and then having both cloud providers access it. So to answer your question specifically around egress costs, today, I would say you as a customer are able to negotiate advantageous costs when it comes to egress. I've seen egress traffic costs discounted as much as 40%. So as part of the negotiation, that should be in there. You want to make sure that you're leveraging your entire purchasing power. So if you're going to Microsoft, make sure if you've got an enterprise agreement, you're taking advantage of that during the negotiation. And the same thing with AWS and Google. So I would say today the egress costs are still there, but I haven't seen them as a showstopper as much as they used to be in the past.
Okay, great. Next question, Elias, if you want to follow along in the Q&A console, comes from Ken. And if I understand the question, he's talking about cost management related to cloud use management. And he's asking if there's a third-party tool for that compatible with Microsoft, AWS, and Google Cloud platforms.
The answer is yes. Most of the cloud optimization tools, most of these cloud cost tools will typically support the large cloud providers, and I would highly recommend that you use them. There's a lot of them. I'm not going to mention anyone in particular here. Feel free to drop me a message if you like. I'm happy to share with you some of the ones that I've personally worked with. But most of them will assess what you're using. So most of them will look at, let's say, you've created several EC2 instances or Azure virtual machine instances, but maybe you don't have reserved instances applied to them. Or maybe you are using a machine and 6 months into it, you're only using 50% of the CPU requirements. It will make an immediate recommendation that, hey, for the last 6 months, you've only used 50% of the CPU. I recommend you change your family type, your EC2 family type, to something that is lower in order to lower the price. So there's a lot of these tools that will monitor your environment and will be able to give you recommendations based on how you're using it. And this is important because when you're creating these resources in the cloud, you're going to have the same challenges that you had on premises, which is you're going to come up against the application owners. The application owners are immediately going to tell you, well, the system requirements for this is, 12 gig of memory, so I need 24. And sometimes you can win this battle by, forcing them back into like something reasonable. Other times it's not worth dying on that hill, and what you want to do is let them have the resources that they need. They're paying for it. Make sure that they're paying for it using a good showback or chargeback strategy. But what you can do is 3 months or 6 months later, you can come back to them and say, hey, for the last 6 months, you haven't used more than 50%. Can we bring this down to a different family instance type? So there's a lot of these tools that will help you tweak the environment on an ongoing basis. So I would highly recommend you use them.
Okay, great. There's another question from Christian, and we thank Christian for sending in those questions and invite the other attendees to send them in also. We have plenty of time to get them answered. Christian asked, for SaaS MultiCloud, what is the advice for reviewing term and service/privacy statements for third-party integrations, API microservices? How do you best evaluate these for security concerns and data ownership? This one is tricky. So the terms and services, you definitely want to have legal counsel look at some of these. The challenge is a lot of times the legal counsel doesn't understand the terms and conditions of cloud providers. They are definitely getting better. This is a question that I'm going to respectfully try and dodge and not answer. If you'd like, just drop me a note offline. I'll make a recommendation to a few people that really specialize in this area that will give you a better answer than I can. So I won't try to wing it and answer it, but it is definitely a concern. Data ownership, I will say, in the T's and C's, it's almost always well-defined. It's clear who has access to the data. You want to be careful, though, here, and this is something that I also always tell customers. Having access to the data is half the challenge. Almost everyone will give you access to the data.
The data is going to be useless, though, if there isn't somewhere where you can import that data, ingest that data, and be able to manipulate. This is something that I usually talk to customers when they're trying to assess whether or not they want to go to cloud, to a cloud provider of any sort, especially SaaS. So you bring up a great point. And I don't know if you're in higher ed, but in higher ed in particular, higher education, customers will tend to choose SaaS providers that are the only SaaS provider in the space. And 3 or 4 months later, by the time they call me or I'm talking to them, they're basically saying, well, the provider will give us access to the data. I'm like, okay, and then what? Where are you going to be able to use that data? So as part of assessing a SaaS provider, which is what you're probably doing or thinking about, this is the time to assess not just the data ownership, but plan B. If I were to exit this SaaS provider, where do I go? First, identify if there's even a second cloud provider in the space. If there is, does this second provider accept the data from the first? Like, do they have methodologies, best practices, plugins, conversion tools, consultants that can move you, let's say, from an SAP to a Dynamics 365 on Microsoft? If there isn't, then you have a bigger challenge there, because now it becomes a business decision. You have to go back to your business and say, hey, we have access to the data, but we're kind of locked in. If this provider goes away, I'm not really sure what we can do with the data. The rest of your question, though, if you like, drop me a note, and I'll find you a person that can answer it for you.
Okay, moving right along. Next question in the Q&A console reads, are organizations really using different services from different providers and integrating them?
The answer is yeah, definitely. And again, the example I gave, it's a Microsoft and Oracle partnership. I know a lot of customers that will put their Exadata, for example, on Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, and others, they'll use the Oracle databases, for example, on Oracle Cloud, and then they'll integrate with Microsoft for everything else. The caveat here, the gotcha here, is you want to make sure that this service, last time I checked, wasn't yet available in all Microsoft regions and Oracle Cloud regions. So depending on where you are in the world, you want to make sure that the region that you plan on using has that support. That region has connectivity, let's say, back to Oracle. You can use a lot of these services over the internet, connect them back to each other. For example, if you're using, let's say you want to use Active Directory across both AWS and Azure, you can use that whether you're going through some kind of an interconnection in a colo or VPN, direct VPN over the internet. There are ways of connecting them. It'll just depend on the nature of the application, sensitivity, the latency of the application. But the answer is yes. Many customers are using this approach.
Okay. Next question reads, do we need to train separate teams for separate cloud providers?
Like we talked about in the presentation, if you're looking at development teams, then I would say yes. My experience says yes. If you're looking at development teams for AWS and Azure, it's unlikely that you're going to use the same development team for both, for obvious reasons, different APIs, different SDKs, different programming languages, etc. If you're looking at infrastructure and operations and security teams, I would say unless the organization is very large and you're able to justify it from a workload perspective, I would say the same team should be very easily able to manage multiple cloud providers.
Okay. Next question reads, should we use third-party management tools to consolidate management silos?
I would say it depends. So for cost optimization, third-party tools, I would say hands down, go for it. When it comes to provisioning, this one is probably the biggest concern. I would say make sure that you're assessing the capabilities. Now, here I'll say you're always going to revert back to the native tools for something. I've always seen it happen. You're going to use the native tools for something. So keep that in mind as an expectation. You're going to need to use the native tools. But if you've done your homework properly, if you've started by using the native tools first and have a good inventory of the features, the services that you use on these native tools, then I would say you're able to leverage third-party tools to consolidate that area as well with relative ease across all cloud providers because you know what's possible, and your expectation is, I'm still going to use the native tool, but this is giving me a level of standardization and consistency that I need, especially if let's say you're using something like a Puppet, a Chef, an Ansible, Terraforms, etc. It's giving you consistency. Although you're going to still make modifications when you're using across different clouds, the modifications aren't going to be as drastic or as complex as using the native tools independently. So I would still say yes, just make sure that you know what to expect as you're using them. When you're going into monitoring, I would say for monitoring, yes. For backup, I would say for backup, yes. Again, you're going to have the same challenges with all of them. Does the backup solution support IaaS? Probably yes, because that's usually either you're integrating with the operating system, it's an agent of some sort, it's tying into some kind of an API. So I would say there it's highly likely. But then you might see some services, some past services, where a backup solution either doesn't support today or will never support. So in order to back up that past solution, you're going to revert back to some form of native capabilities. So you'll have to assess them on a one-by-one basis, but for the most part, I would say yes.
Okay. Next question reads, are most organizations adopting a multi-cloud strategy by design or by accident?
That's a great question. So in the past, I would say almost all organizations, I would say it was by accident. For a variety of reasons. I mean, multi-cloud, the way I think multi-cloud started, is a lot of organizations were using AWS, and the way that, for example, Azure came into the picture is through Microsoft 365 or through Office 365. So what Microsoft was doing is they were essentially giving you free Azure credits. For a while there, you needed ExpressRoute in order, if you wanted better consistency of performance, to Office 365. You were using Azure Active Directory for Office 365. And at one point, you took a step back and said, well, I've got all of these assets in Azure, and I've got these Azure credits. What else can I use Azure for? And bada bing, bada boom, now you have Azure and AWS. A lot of times, it was shadow IT, right? So shadow IT was leveraging AWS, whether it's the marketing department, developers, whomever, they were using their credit card, they were leveraging AWS, but then enterprise IT was operationalizing Azure or Google or some other cloud provider and didn't even know that they even had a cloud estate with AWS, and then they had to reconcile it. The mergers and acquisitions, I've heard that one more and more often than I can recall, where, hey, they were very happy on one cloud provider, but boom, here comes an acquisition that brought in a second cloud provider. The question then became, what do we do? The options were, well, I can move everything to the current cloud provider. That's going to be operationally challenging. It's going to be time consuming. It's going to be costly, but that's fine. We're going to move it. But what happens if, next week we make another acquisition and the whole cycle starts again? That's what forced organizations to say, no, we need a different approach, multi-cloud. Big bank in the U.S., I won't mention names, also was consolidated on one cloud provider, and they were happy with their choices. But then their regulators basically stepped in and said, diversify. That forced a diversification that maybe IT wasn't ready for it. So in the beginning, I would say almost all of these happened by accident or not by design. I think today, and based on the conversation, the presentation, and the summit that you guys are having today, a lot of organizations are understanding these challenges and are trying to get ahead of what can they expect, what are the best practices, and how do they plan for it as opposed to how do they react to it.
Okay, let's squeeze in one more question. This comes from Alexander. He says, do you feel like the number of available services for many tasks is starting to outpace SMB's vendor selection capabilities versus going with the most conveniently marketed vendors by default?
Yeah, and this is not just, this is across the board. I think even the services that come out as a regular cloud providers, you go to reInvent or you go to an Ignite or any of the Google events, one year, I don't remember which year it was, there was a 500 plus new services and capabilities. It was impossible. Even as an analyst, it was impossible to keep up with what does what, and every one of them had its own branding and its own capabilities. It was difficult. I think that's a challenge that we continue to face. I think the cloud providers in general are starting to recognize that, and hopefully they're starting to move more towards industry solutions. And what I mean by industry solutions is they're going to package things in that, hey, if you're in manufacturing, maybe these are the set of tools and capabilities that manufacturers usually use based on how we've seen them use our platform. This is what they're using. I think the same thing is going to apply to a lot of these management tools where they need to compartmentalize these capabilities a little more in order for them to be digestible, and otherwise it's just noise. I mean, there's just too many capabilities that you're not really using. But this is, again, something that if you start with the native tools first, after a while, a couple of months, let's say, you're going to know what you really need. Or you're going to know what the gap is, like what is missing from these native tools. And as a result, you can go find a cloud provider or a management tool that meets your specific needs while ignoring everything else that they potentially have. So focus on your list of requirements as opposed to everything that they offer. But that's definitely still a challenge.
Okay, well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Elias, for a great presentation and answering all those questions.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Top 10 Multi-Cloud Management Tips, Tricks, and What Not to Do. So take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Nutanix, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, our sponsor, Nutanix, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Enterprise Multi-Cloud Management Best Practices Summit, called Top 10 Multi-Cloud Management Tips, Tricks, and What Not to Do. Our speaker for this session is Howard M. Cohen, Senior Resultant at the Tech Channel Partners Results Group. He's a 35-plus year executive veteran of the information technology industry who today writes for and about the IT channel. He's a frequent speaker at IT industry events that include Microsoft Inspire, Citrix Synergy Summit, ConnectWise IT Nation, Channel Pro Forums, Cloud Partners Summit, MicroCorp One-on-One, and CompTIA ChannelCon. He also frequently hosts and presents webinars for many vendors and publications. Take it away, Howard.
Thank you, Chris. And by the way, for those of you who are eagle-eyed and spotted that Chris mentioned that I'm a 35-plus year veteran, 40 is more than 35, so he was correct. He was accurate. But somebody just pointed out to me recently that I'm still in the IT channel, even though I'm writing for and about it, and that's fine by me. So I updated the number. Okay, we are here today not to talk about me, but to talk about the top 10, wow, got the wrong header on it, top 10 multi-cloud tips, tricks, and best practices. Something wrong with the slide here. But anybody who's been to one of my presentations knows that I like to start every presentation with a word. I'm big on words, being a writer. And today's word is complexity. So in terms of the things not to do, here's the first thing not to do. Don't climb into the cave. It's a bad idea. It's hard to get yourself out. We create our own complexity in a lot of cases. And with multi-cloud, we don't need to. There's plenty of complexity there for us. Why is that? Well, okay. When we say multi-cloud, first of all, let's define our term there. We're talking about using more than one cloud of the same kind generally. Most people would admit that they're really referring to the hyperscalers, the big cloud providers like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. But anytime you're using more than one of the same kind of cloud, like more than one public cloud, it's multi-cloud. If you're using some on-prem, some public and private cloud, what have you, mixed up together, that's really more hybrid than multi-cloud. But for our purposes today, it's when you're using multiple public cloud services like these. Now, of course, the question is, why would you do that? Isn't one cloud enough? And let me suggest that multi-cloud is kind of like shopping. All right, you go to department stores when you're looking for something to buy. And you go to multiple department stores, like you see here, and let's consider Amazon to be a department store for our purposes. You go to multiple stores to get the best selection. You may not find the shoes you're looking for in Macy's. So you go to Kohl's, or maybe you used to go to Century 21. You go to another store to find what you're looking for. Not only are you shopping for exactly the one you're looking for with all the features you're looking for, but you're also looking for the best price, let's face it. And those are elements of the decision-making that we do in multi-cloud. Of course, where does the complexity come in that? And here, this is pretty straightforward. Well, the complexity comes in when it comes time to return something. Where did you get it? Where did you buy it? If you took the tags off, you may forget. Issues like that, more delicate issues, tend to get confusing. And that's just the beginning of the confusion with multi-cloud. So, for some reason, the headers on these slides have changed, and I apologize for that. But you are at the right place. This is the multi-cloud session. We're going to talk in today's session about overcoming complexity and the complexities that you can face when dealing with multiple clouds. The first of those is in the area of finance. Then we're going to take a look at the area of workloads and what to do with them. Overall operations of your network system, governance of your network, and let's start with finance. Surprising place to start, I know. But with multi-cloud, it is an important consideration. I'll show you why. The first is, let's look at virtual machines. Let's say we're looking to subscribe to a specific virtual machine with a specific configuration. We're looking for so much and so much RAM, so many cores, so much storage, and we're looking for a machine that's really set up for a specific kind of functionality, with a specific operating system, specific databases. Okay, we have our configuration. We know everything we need to know about this virtual machine, and we take a look and we find it on Azure. And it's a little expensive. Okay, that's Azure. Let's take a look at Amazon for the exact same machine. And look at that, it's more expensive. Okay, but we do get free shipping. Okay. Then we take a look over at Google, and hey, good news, Google's price is much lower than everybody else's. So we subscribe to Google for our virtual machine. Terrific, until Google raises its price on that virtual machine. Now we're in trouble. We are using the more expensive version of the exact same virtual machine that we could get for less elsewhere. And what do? We simply shift over to Azure and start using their service instead. Now, of course, we do that as long as we've noticed there's been a price change. And here's where finance comes in. Somebody needs to be keeping a vigilant eye on things like pricing, mainly because they're constantly changing. Prices amongst the three different cloud services and all the other alternate cloud services are constantly changing. There's always an opportunity to find a lower price. And in many cases, it is a race to the bottom. They are all competing with each other and driving prices downward. Therefore, we need to be looking out for price changes, specials. They're constantly running specials and special promotions and deals and programs. You need somebody whose job is to keep an eye on the multiple clouds that you're using and know about every change. It's not just pricing. Policies change, capacities change, the very functionality of a given service may change. Somebody has to be keeping an eye on all that. Also, somebody's got to be keeping an eye on the virtual machines themselves. The fact of the matter is that in a self-service world like cloud, you've got users who request a particular service, like a virtual machine, and they spin it up, and they use it, and they do what they need to do, and then they're on to the next. What they forget to do, they forgot to release it. So now you're paying for that virtual machine, and it's doing absolutely nothing for you. You end up with phantom virtual machines all over the place. And you're paying for them, and you're paying for them, and they're not doing a thing for you anymore. So here again, that vigilant eye concept, crucial. Somebody has to be keeping an eye on the use of things like virtual machines and other services that are requested, used, and released. That's the whole idea of cloud. And in multi-cloud, it's much bigger. There's much more requesting going on. There's a lot more services being used. So it's crucial to keep an eye on your virtual machines. Okay, let's take a look at our concerns regarding workloads. First up, building workloads. Now, you're going to build an environment in which you have developers who want to be able to create the next great application for your company, create the next great workload that your divisions and departments can use, and they're going to need some kind of a platform to do that on. Each of the cloud providers provides platform as a service, and therefore you're going to need to pick and choose which ones you prefer to use. It may be that your developers pick and choose which one to use. That's fine. But you've got to be in control of that so that they have platform as a service capability. Once they've developed their workload, they have to have an organized, structured way to spin those up and roll those out. And so you need release and deployment orchestration. Each of the cloud providers offers this. You may like one methodology better than another. Again, something you and your development team need to make decisions about. And now, again, you have a choice amongst many. A lot of the applications, a lot of the workloads you're going to be developing are going to be done in a cloud-native fashion. That is to say, you're going to be using microservices in containers. If so, not only do you need Docker and other tools like that to develop your containers and to put the microservices into them, you're also going to probably want to run Kubernetes to orchestrate all of those containers flying all over your multiple clouds. That's one of the great advantages of cloud native. That's why they call it cloud native. You can transport those containers to wherever they're needed at any given time to do what they need to do. You need the ability to organize that. You're going to have millions of these things flying around, and something's got to be governing all that. Kubernetes is a wonderful platform for that. There are others, but you need to have something in place to make sure that you're doing that. All of this facilitates having a DevOps initiative going on in your company. And I strongly recommend if you're doing cloud native, you've got to be doing DevOps, bringing the software developers together with those who are operating the computer systems that run this software, and constantly getting feedback from the users, getting it back to the developers, and issuing a new iteration of the software, releasing it, deploying it, getting feedback, and getting that cycle going as quickly as possible to achieve continuous improvement of your application through continuous deployment over and over again of new and improved versions of the software. The faster you can do that, the more responsive you can be, and therefore, in a multi-cloud environment where there's so many more services readily available to you, you need to manage this very, very closely. Okay, we've built our workloads. We're also going to want to migrate some workloads in from elsewhere, particularly if we're still in the midst of migrating from on-prem to the cloud, to multi-cloud in this case. As with any project like this, you need to assess your requirements first. And by the way, all of the bullets on this slide are going to be about planning your migration, not even executing it. So you assess your requirements first. Based on your configuration of multiple clouds, you need to determine which migration tools will work best for what you're trying to accomplish. So you're going to have to study them. You're going to have to compare and contrast them. You're going to have to make some very key decisions as to what goes where, what is stored where, what will be using what services from where. You have multiple choices now, and you're going to have to take a lot more time to interrogate each of those choices, evaluate each of those choices. In the early going of multi-cloud, expect this to take more time. It's inevitable that it's going to take more time. It's something you've never done before. You're going to be needing to provision resources, processing power, RAM, storage, different services. You're going to need to be provisioning all your resources. So that needs to be planned out as part of the migration as well. In terms of your applications, we just talked about cloud native. You may have some legacy monolithic software still working for you that you're going to want to convert. But even short of that, you may have applications that need some kind of modification to move from on-prem into cloud. You need to know that first. You don't want to be stuck in the middle of the move and discover that, it doesn't run here. Not good. And when you plan your migration itself, you need to be sure that you're planning for minimal disruption of day-to-day operations. You want to be making the migration when there's nobody using these particular workloads, if possible. If you're 21 shift, you have to figure out when you're going to tell people to stop using for a period of time, and you're going to have to plan to be very quick. But you want to minimize operational disruption as much as you can. And based on what we just said a moment ago about finding out a nasty surprise right in the middle of the migration, you're going to want to provide some kind of rollback contingency. This is part of selecting your migration tools. How easy is it to roll back? We've gone halfway through the migration. We discover a bad surprise. How do we simply back off and leave things where they were when we started? Rollback is a pretty crucial part of what we're doing here. Next up, in terms of workloads, we're going to start talking about purchasing and implementing what you need to get those workloads working. And the first consideration, to me, the most important consideration, is actually the same one that a lot of people are looking at in literally every software decision they make today. And that is, what integrations are available? How do I make this software work with other software that I'm using? With minimal middleware or minimal configuration, it should be easy to integrate these together. I may have to use a third-party service, but I want to be able to integrate my CRM with my ERP and have both talking to my marketing automation and so forth. The presence of APIs to allow you to do that yourself is critical in most shops, but in a lot of cases, there is native integration available to you. You should be aware of it and take advantage of it if it indeed does exactly what you need it to do. Once you've determined that you're in the right environment, you need to map your workloads to the clouds and to their services. What's going to go where? And again, this is a function of which one will do the best job and at the lowest price. Cost effective is a term you should burn into your brain. It's always a function of being cost effective. You want to select your services knowing which cloud does what best, and if they all are the same, then you probably want to know which one costs least. You need to have an integration framework, understand what goes where, and how you're going to weave things together. You may be using third-party services. You may be using existing APIs. You need to make sure that you have all your own rules and regs for how these things go together and how the function between them is orchestrated. How do we make these work nicely together and with minimal intervention. Then there's the user considerations for your workloads. Obviously, you want to provide self-service console so that they can pick and choose what they need when they need it. At the same time, we talked before about phantom VMs. You must always be monitoring their utilization of resources. The most prevalent concern is that they are using those resources and they're not sitting idle. But they may be using the wrong resource. They may be using a less efficient resource. You need to be ready to advise them to make a change if you're going to provide that level of self-service. Additionally, you want to be monitoring capacities. This is something that I think a lot of people overlook. One of the big advantages of moving to cloud in the first place was that you can configure exactly what you need, not what you're probably going to need down the road. For example, if you're configuring a physical server and you put a 4 terabyte drive in it, you may only be using about a terabyte of it right now. And for the lifetime of the thing, you may eventually get up to using all 4 terabytes. But between the time of purchase and that time, you have storage sitting there idle, and you've paid for it. With cloud, if you need a terabyte, you configure a terabyte. When you need another terabyte, you add another terabyte. You simply subscribe to more. Big advantage. You flex the resource as you flex the need. In many cases, users will simply default to the way they've always done it, figuring out, what am I going to need 2-3 years down the road? And you end up paying for storage services you aren't using. If you're monitoring the capacities in use, you'll see that, and you'll correct for it, and you'll save money. At the same time, you always want to preserve the layer of abstraction. In the original definition of cloud computing, NIST defines a layer of abstraction between the user and the underlying technology. The goal is to keep the user focused on their work, on what they're there to do, rather than on the platform they're doing it on. That should be somebody else's concern, your concern. And so you want to do everything you can to always preserve that layer of abstraction so that the user is just doing what they do, and there's somebody picking up after them, I'm afraid. All of using your network begins with identity and access management. And I can't reinforce that enough, especially in a multi-cloud environment where you're giving people access to so many resources, such a broad wealth of resources. You want to make sure that whoever logs into your network is who they say they are and has a right to be there. At the same time, you want to make sure that the device that they're using won't cause a problem because it's insecure or because it's improperly configured, insufficiently configured. You want to make sure that the device and the user have everything they need to properly connect to your network, use your resources. And so all the focus you put on identity and access management is very worthwhile. And you need to make sure that this is something that you've locked up tight as a drum. Which brings us to operations. We've now got our workloads configured. We know what we're spending. We know how we're controlling what we're spending. What do we need to be concerned with in operations? Well, in the operation of a multi-cloud environment, you're constantly going to be provisioning resources. People are going to be deciding they need to use a specific service. They need to have more capacity for storage or for something else somewhere. You're the one making decisions as to where and which service they use, but you still want to preserve self-service. And so you need to be talking to that self-service console and directing it in terms of where it's going to allow them to pull resources from. One of the reasons you do this is to avoid sprawl. I said to avoid cloud sprawl in the slide, but really it's sprawl. People tend to configure what they need when they need it and spin it on up. And before long, you've got all bunches of stuff spun on up and just sitting there idle because the person that was using them is finished. That's why you monitor capacity. That's why you monitor utilization. So those things must be in place to prevent sprawl from occurring. Sprawl is very hard to reverse, and sprawl can be unnecessarily expensive. And budget is a huge concern in this big an operation. One thing we're seeing more and more people focus on, and it's worth focusing on, is the concept of geography. A cloud service is basically a collection of cloud data centers distributed all over the world, hundreds of them. If you have a workload that a particular customer organization is using, let's say that they're in London, you're probably going to want to put that workload on a cloud data center that's in London. It may be a Google cloud data center. It may be an Azure cloud data center or Amazon. Whichever one it is, that's probably the one that you want to put it on because it represents fewer hops across the network to get to the user and less time to travel. I know that sounds ridiculous. It sounded ridiculous to me the first time I heard it, but it's been proven, it's been clocked that, yes, if you're using a data center that's much closer to you, you're enjoying much lower latency. So it's good to explore that. It's good to plan around it and determine whether or not you can, if you're having a latency issue, maybe you want to relocate from the data center it's in to another data center. That can be done for you working with the cloud services. I will say that one of the workloads that this is most popular with are the services that are now delivering complete desktops from the hyperscaler cloud services to your users. When you're delivering an entire desktop as a workload, the closer it is, the better the latency is. And the lower the latency is, the happier the user is, and so forth and so on from there. As I mentioned earlier, you always want to use the least cost provider. But let's qualify the phrase least cost. Okay? If you're compromising the quality of service to get a lower cost, you're accomplishing nothing. Matter of fact, you're going backwards. So it has to be a combination of the least cost provider for the best possible service. And you need to make that determination. So you've constantly got to be evaluating comparatively services from each of the hyperscalers, what they cost and how well they perform. And again, that's why you need such a substantial management team to focus on these different challenges and to be constantly evaluating available pricing as well as changes to the service and increases or decreases in service level. Next up, workflow automation. In terms of your operations, workflow automation has a lot of implications. Obviously, we're all accustomed to load balance, trying to keep all of our resources similarly taxed without overtaxing some and leaving others sitting idle. Load balancing has been around forever. It continues to be around. You're now load balancing not just between resources, but between cloud providers. So it's another layer of abstraction for you. Virtual machine orchestration. You want to make sure that you're not overtaxing a given physical server in a cloud service by having too many of your virtual machines in it. You want to make sure that they're distributed. This does usually get taken care of by the cloud provider. It's good for you to be conscious of it, especially because you do need to be concerned with cross-cloud orchestration. When you're moving things between clouds, you need to make sure that you're doing it in the most efficient way possible and using tools that will accomplish that for you as efficiently as they can. Another implication of workflow automation that's a little bit coming from another direction is the fact that we're all now responsible for a growing number of remote workers. Obviously, the COVID pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, forced a lot of people to go work from home, and everybody discovered, hey, that's pretty good. And so they're doing it. A growing number of them don't want to come back to the office. They want to continue working from home. And many employers want that too. They're reducing their overall operating costs. They're getting more efficiency. They're getting more productivity out of users who are working from home. So we want to accommodate that. Some managers are concerned that their people aren't working if they can't see them working, which is ridiculous. It's been proven ridiculous. But workflow management can make the difference for them to turn their perspective around. That is to say, a remote worker can log into the workflow management engine and indicate that they've begun a task. When they're done, they can indicate that they've ended that task. And now that manager has better information than they've ever had before. They know exactly how long things take. And they don't have to examine just one. They can examine many that they've collected over time, and they can identify trends. They can see which of their people is doing a task faster than the others, which one is doing fewer of them, even though they're doing them quickly, which of them doesn't seem to be doing anything at all, and which of them seems to be killing themselves, knocking it out like crazy. This is empirical data. This is not just casual observation. This is much better than watching the worker work. And workflow automation can give that to us. So giving remote workers the opportunity to manage themselves using a remote workflow automation solution can be a tremendous boon to any company. I could spend an entire session talking about data and network security. One thing in a multi-cloud environment you must be very conscious of is that the connects between clouds are vulnerable. They are as vulnerable as an endpoint. Therefore, they need to be protected that way. You need to make sure that they are carefully protected so that nobody can compromise them and thereby breach your network. You want to make extensive use of federation in terms of your directory of services available, in terms of your directory of users, all the objects that you're managing in one cloud environment. Now multiply it for as many cloud environments as you have. So federating them together gives you much tighter control. So to the best of your ability, use federation services where they're available to you. Many managers prefer to use single sign-on. There are those who don't want to use single sign-on. Obviously, you need to take into account the fact that users, when they can't remember their password, do awful and very, very foolish things. They write their password on a sticky note and put it on the bottom of their keyboard thinking nobody will find it. Ridiculous. They use weak passwords, although we're now preventing that. Many people are using multi-factor authentication, and as a matter of fact, there's a lot of talk of passwords going away completely throughout our environment. There are other ways to authenticate people. And so multi-factor authentication, where you combine something you know, your password, with something you have, your mobile phone, is a much more powerful way to protect your network. These are all part of an overall identity and access management methodology and strategy. Crucial when you're talking about these many resources, as is directory management. Crucial when you're talking about this many resources. You need to be able to manage them in the context of each other. And it's a much larger context when you're dealing with multiple clouds, multiple cloud services. And so you need to pay special attention to them in this environment. The title of this session is MultiCloud Management, and therefore we should talk about it. The goal for most people is to establish a single pane of glass management methodology so that you can see everything in the context of each other. That word context keeps coming up. As a network manager, you know that you want to be able to see things and compare them to each other. If I do this, how does it impact that? If I'm using this much here, how much should I be using there? balancing things and making sure that things remain under control. The closer you can get to that single pane of glass functionality, the better off you are. And the most important thing they need to give you is visibility. You need to see everything. You need to see all of the storage that you're using, all of the services that you're using, all of the workloads you have active right now, all the virtual machines you have operating right now, those that are not operating, they're just sitting idle. You need visibility of how many users are on the network right now. Why are there users on the network in a location where the office isn't open? These are things you want to be able to see vividly, have pointed out to you. And you can, depending on the management platform you select. You need to be able to see all of the different services that are currently in use, and are they the ones you specified? Are those the ones you decided upon? Shadow IT is not limited to physical locations with on-premises resources. Users can overcome your best efforts to control them and spin up services that you never intended to spin up. You need to be conscious of that, because not for nothing, but you let them loose in the wall, and they have all the department stores available to them. Danger, danger. You need to be monitoring and managing performance. If there's a problem, it may be beyond your control. In most cases, it will be, because you're dealing with somebody else's operation. You need to know when to reach out to your cloud provider and tell them you're encountering an operational problem that's impacting your performance. You have a quality of service to expect, a service level that you've agreed to. Hold your provider's feet to the fire about that, always, especially in a multi-cloud environment. We talked before about monitoring and managing capacities. Here again, I'll repeat it. You'd be amazed by, if you went back to your own multi-cloud environment right now, how much capacity is sitting idle that you're paying for and nobody is using. It's very common. So you need to be monitoring that and managing it proactively. And as I said, you want to be able to monitor all activity on your network to make sure that everybody who's using your multiple clouds is somebody who should be using your multiple clouds. And then in terms of operations, finally, we get to disaster recovery and business continuity. Now, this is something that's going to need to be completely redefined. Right? In the old days, when it was all on-prem, you had concerns like, who's the floor marshal for a given floor of the building? Who's going to make sure that everybody gets together and goes down the fire stairs to get out of the building? Where's everybody going to regroup? There's still some of that. People are still operating in office buildings, and that will continue for the foreseeable future. But you also need to think about, if you have people working out of their homes, how do you find out which homes were impacted? And what instructions do you give to those people for when something does happen, God forbid, at their home? Those physical things need to be redefined. But things like what fails over to where? If you have access to all three clouds and suddenly you lose access to one of them, what do? Do you instruct the cloud provider to fail everything over for you? You need to have a strategy in place for those eventualities. And you have to try to imagine every contingency, even the contingency that a cloud provider may go dark completely, not just to you, but globally. It's almost beyond our comprehension, but we can't allow it to be. It could happen. Also, who fails over to where? If somebody's house is indeed affected, I mean, thinking about the New York area and how they were impacted by Superstorm Sandy, nobody there expected that kind of storm to ever hit that area. People's homes were completely demolished in that storm. What do you tell them to do? What do they need to know before that happens so they know where to go? Do you have a warm site for them to shelter in where they can work or maybe can't? What's been put in place for eventualities like that? Plans are made at the best of time to cover the worst of times. you need a good disaster recovery and business continuity plan to make sure that you can continue operating. In terms of your providers, if one fails, which one do you go to instead? That needs to be decided in advance. You can't suddenly be shopping the other services to decide where to put a workload. That needs to be planned out. Are you going to have any redundancies? Do you have your own warm site for people to go to? Do you have your own redundant servers to fail over last resort? These are decisions people are making today. And you'd be surprised at how many of them still refuse to depend solely on cloud and must have an on-premises alternative in place just in case. Not the worst thinking in the world. You also need to remember that you're expected to remain compliant. Even in disaster, you are expected to remain compliant with all regulations, all policies, which inevitably brings us to governance. And in terms of governance, the first step is policy development, and for some reason all the bullets are already up, so we'll just go through them quickly. You need an acceptable use policy. You have users using your network. Some may be using your network for their own purposes from time to time. It happens. You need to let them know what they can and cannot use your network resources for. The shining example is email. It is altogether possible for one of your users to send an absolutely awful, inappropriate email to a fairly substantial audience. If you have not indicated to them that that's not allowed, you can be held liable for any damage caused by that inappropriate communication. If you've told them that they're not allowed to do that and they've agreed that they're not allowed to do that, it's all their fault and it's all their problem. And that's how it should be. If somebody's going to make a stupid decision, they should take responsibility for it. You need identity and access policies. Who's allowed to connect to the network? What are they allowed to use? How does that work? So that everybody knows this is what you can and cannot do. This is who who is allowed on, who is not. Access policies. Don't share your passwords. Data sensitivity and criticality is an issue. There's a lot of data that cannot be shared with anybody else, most all data in most cases. And yet you have users who simply sign on to the network, take a data file and send it to somebody using their own personal email or messaging service. That's got to be expressly forbidden in policy so that they are told, not just that they know it, but they are told that by you. And in terms of criticality, what cannot be lost? What can the business not do without? Users need to be aware of that so they can't say, gee, I didn't know. Data backup and retention policy is an interesting issue in that most federal rules for common procedure indicate that you get to set your own retention policy. But you must abide by the retention policy you establish. So if you decide you're going to delete all emails after 6 months, you have to delete all emails after 6 months. If anything is found in your email that's older than 6 months, you may have a problem. If anything is looked for and should still be there, but it's gone before 6 months, you may stand to have a very big problem. Again, it's in your control. You set the policy, but you must abide by the policy that you set. This is true anywhere, not just MultiCloud. Proper incident response. If you're compromised, in many cases, there is a very specific requirement to report to very specific agencies in a very specific way. You must be aware of those. If you're not aware of those, go make yourself aware of those as soon as we're done here. You must report. Imagine having a compromise that clobbers you, cripples you, and then you get fined because you didn't report on time. Adding insult to injury, not something you want. it's something you need to avoid. So become familiar with what your incident reporting responsibilities are and be sure that everybody knows what to do should something like that occur. And finally, policies around disaster recovery and business continuity. Everybody needs to know what's expected of them so they can do it in that worst of times situation. Of course, once you have policies developed, those policies need to be enforced. And my best recommendation is to establish a culture of compliance. This is something those of you who have been to my presentations before know that I talk about often, the concept of the culture of the company. It trickles down from the top. Obviously, it's led by senior management, but it's handed down layer by layer throughout the company that this is how we operate. This is who we are. And in terms of compliance, it's not something we take idly. It's something we take very seriously and do everything we need to make sure that we comply. This has got to be clear to everybody. You have to apply it consistently across all of your personnel. They need to know that there are consequences, and when those consequences are visited upon somebody, that's visible to everybody. And this all begins with their confirmation of understanding. When you issue policies, you must have your users sign off on a copy and return that to you so that you can prove at any time that not only did they receive them, but they indicated that they read them and understand them. I'm going to speed through risk mitigation because I just looked at the clock. It's important to identify all of your data assets and establish a value for each one so that you know what the value is of each data asset under your management, performing your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats assessments all the time to make sure that you know where you're strong and where you're weak and what you need to do. Not only is threat prevention critical, but it's time to start threat hunting. Your threat surface has expanded dramatically, and therefore you need to go looking to see if there are anomalies out there that indicate that something may soon be going wrong. You need to be proactive about that. You need to be in front of that. Don't wait for something to happen. Go looking for it so that you catch it before it happens. Remember that there are 3 levels of compliance. There's your software provider policies. Every time you use software, you're signing an end user license agreement, a EULA. You have to abide by it. You have to abide by the company policy we've been talking about for the past several minutes. You need to also abide by applicable government regulations. This is not news. This is not something that's probably new to any of you, but let it be stated, it's critical that we observe all 3 levels of policy and abide by them and enforce them. And finally, we get back to complexity. We've looked at many different ways you can overcome the complexity of working in a multi-cloud environment. But one thing to remember is that it takes multiple people to manage multi-cloud. You need a team, a finance team, an operations team, a technology team. You need a lot of players keeping a vigilant eye on a lot of things to make sure that everybody's using your multi-clouds to the most efficient way possible. And with that, Chris, I think it's time for us to ask for questions.
Yeah, sure. We got time for a few questions. Thanks so much for that presentation. Let's just jump right in. First question. How do you figure out which cloud does a better job with any particular services when you are balancing so many clouds in one environment?
Yeah, and the answer is try before you buy. One of the advantages of cloud is that you can indeed subscribe to a service, decide you hate it, and get rid of it. If it's that critical to your operation, you may subscribe to the service temporarily to work through it, use it, put it through its paces, do your testing. For less critical services, you may try one and then decide, I think I can do better, and then move to another. You have to assess what the criticality is and then determine your methodology based on that.
Okay, great. Here's a question from Tracy. Do you have a go-to governance framework that you tend to use more than others?
I do not, and I'll tell you why I do not. I don't believe one can have a framework specifically for governance. There are many. I mean, I've seen them out there. The problem is that each organization is so dramatically different, especially in the way that it uses and manages information, that you really got to be thinking ground up. And yeah, it's strongly recommended you survey the frameworks that are available, but I have not yet seen one that jumps out to me as being the ideal model. I don't believe that there can be one. It may be that there are a couple of different varieties that are predominant. That'll emerge as time goes on. But no, I can't name one that I think is better than all the rest.
Okay, this question kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier. When you say culture of compliance, what does culture actually mean in this context?
Okay, that strikes to the heart of my philosophy, right? The most important thing about any given company is its culture, who you are. You know, if it takes a village, what does your village look like? Most people say that culture trickles down from the top, and I agree with that. That if a leader, CEO, chairman, what have you, if the leader has a specific set of beliefs and values, you will see those beliefs and those values reflected in all of their people. And their senior management is responsible for accelerating, pushing that culture down throughout the organization. There are companies that have very healthy, very positive cultures, and there are companies that have very self-destructive cultures. It is almost impossible to just change culture. No, it's impossible. You can't just snap your fingers one day and say, oh, we're not going to do it that way anymore. We're going to believe this. It just doesn't happen. Culture can be shifted over time. It can be influenced and impacted. But it really needs to come from leadership. Leadership needs to indicate that they put a high value on using resources appropriately, for example. Email messaging. It's not appropriate to tell people to do something in email. That may be their value. It may be in their culture to, hey, it's okay to joke around in email. Not for nothing, but there are some cultures that have a very healthy component of humor in them. And that's not bad either. Culture is who the company is. Companies have been legally considered people. I think that emotionally, there is a character to each company, and it's reflected in their culture and how their people adopt and express and manifest that culture. Compliance, it's huge. Compliance is a matter of integrity. Will we do things the way we're supposed to do them, the way in which we've been required to do them, or are we going to have a culture of avoidance where we don't care about the rules? The rules don't apply to us. Rules are for fools. You know, there are cultures like that. And more often than not, they are in companies that are no longer in business. So you know, it's not just the rules and regs, but it's the personal commitment of all the people in the company to upholding those rules and regs and to practicing the things they believe in. That's what a culture is.
All right, thanks for that super in-depth answer. Looks like we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Okay.
Why do you say valuation of the data assets is so important?
That's a simple one. Imagine that you have a data asset that you evaluate at being worth $100,000. And you discover that you're spending about $500,000 to protect it. There's no logic there. You need to look at your data assets to determine how much they're worth and how much it would cost you if you lost them. If you're spending more than that on protecting them, you're wasting a lot of money. You need to come up with a better answer. You need to know what needs more protection, what needs less protection. You need to know what can be compromised, God forbid, and what absolutely cannot be compromised. And so you build bigger, better walls around it. Valuation is your guide to how much to invest where in security and data protection.
Okay, let's do one more. Do you really need to secure the cloud services? Isn't it enough to take care of your own on-prem storage?
And my answer to that is, who's going to get fired? If, God forbid, one of your data assets, a really valuable one, is compromised, corrupted, and held for ransom, stolen outright, you can't get back at it anymore, ever. Who's going to get fired for that happening? Yeah, you can move off of that cloud service and they lose you as a customer, and oh well, they'll still survive. It's very easy, though, for people to be blamed and for a number of people to lose their job over an issue like that. Ultimately, fiduciary responsibility for data assets rests with the customer, no matter where they're putting that data, no matter how they're protecting it. They're still responsible for it. And so if it's me, I take full responsibility every step of the way. I double check everything and I add my own. That's why there are so many companies out there that are making a tremendous success out of protecting cloud data, even though the cloud services themselves provide, they invest more in security than anybody. Still in all, there are third-party providers who keep it all honest and make sure that users can fulfill their obligation to protect their data. And so, it's not that I don't trust the cloud providers. It's that from a fiduciary standpoint, that's just not enough.
Okay, it looks like that's all the time we have for questions. Thanks again for a great talk, Howard.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for listening.